Eliza Monroe was only 22 years old, but in the harsh, frigid environment of Frostline Base, she looked younger. Her brown hair was pulled into twin braids that framed her pale face, and her student identification card was clipped neatly to the oversized intern jacket she wore, swallowing her small frame. The base itself was remote, perched on the edge of the frozen frontier, where the temperature rarely rose above freezing, and the wind never ceased its howling, relentless pace. The constant bite of the wind and the stillness of the place seemed to seep into everything, creating an aura of isolation, and Eliza was no exception. She was one of the countless overlooked faces who shuffled through the base every day, quietly doing the tasks no one else wanted. Her official duties were simple: enter data into computers, brew coffee for the officers, and clean the equipment used by the seasoned military pilots. These were the chores assigned to her as an intern, the tasks that kept her out of the way and kept the more experienced personnel busy with their work. There was nothing glamorous about her role at Frostline. The other interns often joked about her duties, calling her the badge girl because of the way her ID hung from her jacket, a constant reminder that she wasn't one of the experienced personnel, but just a student trying to learn the ropes. Most of the military staff barely even acknowledged her existence, treating her as nothing more than a piece of furniture that occasionally moved. Around the base, she was invisible, not even a shadow in the daily grind of life at Frostline. Yet, when everyone else left for the night, when the halls grew quieter, and the rest of the base settled into an eerie stillness, Eliza remained awake. She had discovered that the flight simulators were unlocked after midnight, and she began to spend hours in the simulation room, running through emergency scenarios that weren't part of her curriculum. The flight simulators had become her escape, a place where she could step into the shoes of someone who had purpose, someone who made a difference. She practiced handling system failures, navigating through severe weather, and landing damaged aircraft in impossible conditions. Scenarios that would terrify even the most seasoned pilots became her nightly routine. Eliza's mind absorbed the data. Her fingers moved expertly over the controls as she responded to each new crisis, each new failure with the calm of someone who had done this 100 times before. Her peers, the other interns, couldn't understand. They would tell her that she was wasting her time, that her job was to observe and learn, not try to be a hero. "You're just here to watch and learn, Eliza. Don't overstep your bounds," they'd say, their words dismissive, their tone filled with a mixture of mockery and concern. But she didn't mind. Eliza was used to being dismissed, used to being ignored. Deep down, she knew that what she was doing mattered more than any of them realized. It wasn't about recognition or praise, it was about preparing for a moment when her preparation would count. Frostline Base, with its rigid hierarchy and cold, detached atmosphere, had no place for an intern like her. The officers were busy, wrapped up in their own routines, focused on their own missions, too absorbed to notice someone like Eliza. She was just a kid, still learning the ropes, and to them, her role was clear. Keep her out of the way and let the real pilots handle the tough stuff. They saw her training on the simulators as nothing more than idle play, a distraction from the real work. Flying a simulator is nothing like the real thing. They would say dismissively. Experience is what matters. You need more than just textbook knowledge. Eliza had heard it all before. They didn't understand, couldn't understand, that she wasn't just playing. She was preparing at night, in the silence of the simulation room. She was someone else. She was the pilot, the one who had to land the aircraft when all seemed lost. Every evening, she ran through the same scenarios, over and over again. Perfecting her responses, she had memorized every emergency protocol, learned every system failure inside and out. She didn't know it yet, but the hours spent alone in that room were preparing her for something none of the seasoned officers could anticipate. They all thought she was wasting time. She knew better, though the days seemed to blend into one another mundane. Unremarkable, Eliza's mind was always elsewhere. It wasn't that she disliked her job. It was simply that it didn't challenge her. The data entry and coffee brewing were necessary, but they didn't spark any sense of fulfillment in her. The real work, the work that could change lives, was happening in the simulation room. The problem was that no one knew it. No one saw her potential, her quiet dedication. They didn't see the late nights spent mastering skills no one expected her to have. Her heart was in the skies, in the ability to understand the aircraft, to maneuver through the storm, to save lives when the situation seemed impossible. No one saw that yet, and it was that very underestimation that would set the stage for everything to come. But for now, Eliza was content to remain in the shadows, perfecting her skills, preparing for the moment when the world would finally see what she was capable of. The frozen winds of Frostline Base continued to howl, the constant reminder of the isolation, the stark coldness that seemed to echo in every corner of the base. But in that cold, in that silence, Eliza was ready for the moment when her name would no longer be ignored, ready for the moment when the world would finally see her, not as the badge girl, but as someone capable of far more than anyone ever imagined. Each night, when the frost settled in and the base fell into its eerie stillness, Eliza would slip into the flight simulator room. It was a place few people cared about, a forgotten corner of the base that came alive only when duty called. But for Eliza, it became a sanctuary, a space where she could stretch her wings in a way that no one else could see. The hum of the simulator was the only sound she ever heard in those moments of solitude. Her fingers would hover over the controls, each move deliberate, practiced, every action, an extension of her desire to be more than just a background figure at Frostline Base. Eliza had long since memorized the emergency protocols, each one running through her mind like clockwork. She had spent hours, days, weeks learning the mechanics of the aircraft, studying every system, every procedure, from handling mechanical failures to navigating through the most extreme weather conditions. Nothing was beyond her reach in that room. She had set up the simulators to replicate every possible scenario she could. Think of from sudden engine failures to full electrical malfunctions. When she failed, and she did, often she would reset, going over the procedure again and again until the response was second nature. Her hands moved like a seasoned pilot's, adjusting the throttle and the flaps, keeping a steady eye on the altitude indicator, just as the simulations demanded. The cockpit of the Cessna 172 in the simulation was small and cramped, but it felt familiar, like a second home to her. Each time she ran through a new simulation, she felt her confidence grow. She was no longer just a student trying to keep up. In the quiet of the simulator room, she was the one in charge, the one whose decisions could mean the difference between life and death. Some nights, the simulations would grow increasingly difficult. Damage to the landing gear, systems failure in the middle of a snowstorm. The aircraft would begin to buck and sway, as if the very air around it was conspiring to tear it apart. But Eliza never wavered. Her eyes never left the controls, her fingers steady on the levers as she corrected course, recalculated the flight path, and adjusted the systems with a precision that made her feel like a professional. It wasn't about the accolades or the attention. It was about the feeling of knowing, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that she could handle whatever was thrown at her. Despite all her effort, none of the other interns seemed to understand. They would laugh, making comments about how she spent too much time in the simulator room, as though she were wasting her nights away. Eliza would hear them murmuring about her when she passed by the break room. "What's she doing? It's just a simulation," one of them would say. "She's not even flying for real," another would chime in, their voices dripping with condescension. But Eliza didn't mind. She couldn't care less what they thought. She wasn't in the simulator room to prove anything to them. She was there for herself, for the future that she knew she was working toward, even if no one else saw it yet. The air in the room was always thick with the hum of the machine, but it felt comforting to Eliza. It was a constant in her otherwise chaotic life. The lights above flickered occasionally, but she never noticed. When the air grew colder, she would wrap her jacket tighter around herself and continue, hour after hour. While the others slept, she practiced. She wasn't running from anything, she was building something, piece by piece. Every night she spent inside that room, no one else had a clue what she was preparing for. The rest of the base had no idea that she was silently becoming someone, capable of handling the impossible. She wasn't foolish enough to believe that spending time in a simulator would make her as skilled as a trained pilot, but it gave her an edge, an understanding of what to do when everything went wrong. And that's what mattered. The others may have thought she was wasting her time, but Eliza was preparing herself for the moment when her training would be the key to saving lives. She didn't need anyone's approval to know that she was on the right path. It was her path, her journey, and she was willing to walk it alone. Sometimes, when she was deeply focused on the task at hand, Eliza would forget the world outside the simulator room. The harsh cold of Frostline Base, the unrelenting winds, the officers who walked past her without so much as a glance, they all disappeared. In those moments, it was just her and the controls. She was so absorbed in the task that she lost track of time. Hours would pass, and before she knew it, the first rays of sunlight would be peeking through the windows. But Eliza wasn't concerned about time. Time had no meaning when she was in the zone, when she was mastering something that only a few would ever truly understand. Her focus was singular: to be prepared, to know every emergency procedure, every flight maneuver, to be able to think and act in the most critical moments. She would practice forced landings, engine failures at high altitudes, and complex navigation through mountain ranges with only the instrument panel to guide her. Each time, she would push herself further, testing her limits, trying to see how far she could go. And each time, her reactions were quicker, her decisions sharper. The impossible didn't seem so impossible anymore. It felt, instead, like an inevitable outcome of her determination. Eliza's dedication was something that came from within, a quiet resolve that was hard for others to see. It was her secret, her personal mission, and she carried it with the same intensity she applied to every simulation. The others couldn't understand it. They didn't see what she saw, didn't feel what she felt. But Eliza wasn't deterred by their doubts. She knew that one day, they would see. One day, when the world needed someone who could act with precision, they would see the quiet, determined intern who had spent countless hours in the simulator room. So, she continued, every night, without fail, she would slip into the flight simulator room, and the rest of the world would fade away. The hum of the machines became a familiar lullaby, a reminder that she was one step closer to being ready for whatever came next. Every time the aircraft lurched, every time the systems failed, Eliza responded with calm precision, her mind focused and her hands steady. The world may have ignored her, but in that room, she was exactly where she needed to be, preparing for the moment that no one could predict, but everyone would need. The calm that blanketed Frostline Base was abruptly shattered by the screech of the emergency alarm. The sudden noise cut through the stillness like a knife, sending ripples of panic through the facility. Red emergency lights flickered on in the control room, casting long, sharp shadows across the walls. Voices crackled over the radio, chaotic and frantic. But one voice stood out, harried, tight with the strain of the situation. F18 Delta, the call sign for the medical evacuation helicopter, was in serious trouble. Its mission was critical, carrying 4 injured soldiers from a forward, positioned to safety, but now it was fighting to stay airborne. The helicopter's pilot reported the issue in clipped, panicked tones. Control tower, this is F18 Delta. We've lost engine 2. Repeat, engine 2 is down. We're losing altitude. Engine failure. We're struggling to maintain control. The words hit hard, each syllable heavy with the weight of impending disaster. The pilot's voice trembled slightly, a stark contrast to the calm professionalism expected in such situations. The helicopter, a crucial lifeline for the wounded soldiers, was spiraling out of control, its left side listing dangerously in the brutal crosswinds that whipped across the mountainside. The once sturdy machine groaned under the pressure as it dipped lower and lower, threatening to crash. In the control room, the military personnel scrambled to react. Officers, radar operators, and flight controllers worked in frantic synchrony, trying to calculate a way to save the helicopter. The room buzzed with tension, voices shouting over each other, but no clear solution was coming forward. The calculations were grim. Every single simulation showed the same outcome: crash landing, probable fatalities. A few of the senior officers turned to their screens, trying to work out an alternate approach, but it was clear they didn't have enough time. The weather was worsening, and the helicopter was rapidly descending. They were running out of options. Eliza, usually a shadow in the corner of the room, watched intently from her station. Her attention was fixed on the radar, her eyes tracking the helicopter's desperate path. Most of the officers were too distracted to notice her, caught up in the chaos. But Eliza wasn't. She recognized the situation immediately. She had trained for this. The exact combination of engine failure, crosswinds, and altitude loss had come up in her simulations countless times. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with the clarity of someone who understood the crisis unfolding. This was her moment. She knew exactly what had to be done. The approach angle was all wrong, too steep, too fast, and with the crosswinds, it would send the helicopter crashing into the ground. But she had a solution. Her mind raced through the protocols she had memorized in the simulator. She leaned forward, her voice barely rising above the frantic chatter around her. "Sir, I recommend a quick vector change to approach Gamma 7. We need to reduce airspeed to 60 knots and deploy emergency flaps." It was a precise suggestion, one that had saved aircraft in simulations more times than she could count. The room fell momentarily silent as the senior officers turned toward her. Her voice was quiet, calm in the face of the chaos, but it was enough to catch the attention of Staff Sergeant Marcus Forster, who was standing near the back of the room. Forster, a grizzled veteran who had seen more than his fair share of combat, observed Eliza with a sharp eye. He had noticed her in the past, noticed her quiet confidence when others were too busy to pay attention, but his was the only face that seemed to register the weight of her words. The others were too caught up in the gravity of the situation, their nerves frayed, their experience failing to give them the edge they needed. Captain Williams, a tall, tense officer with more flight hours than Eliza had years on this earth, whipped around with an irritable snap. Quiet. You're just a student. I call Mo. Captain Williams barked, his voice laced with frustration. This isn't some classroom exercise, this is real life. He turned back to the radar, shaking his head, dismissing her suggestion as nothing more than the fanciful notion of someone who didn't understand the stakes. But Eliza wasn't backing down. Her hands, steady and sure, were already moving toward the controls, her mind running through the sequence of actions she had practiced in the simulator. Every part of her body felt the familiar rhythm, the calm that came from knowledge and preparation. Staff Sergeant Forster, however, didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. Let her try. His words hung in the air, surprising everyone. She's got the knowledge. The pilots are failing to see what she's seeing. Captain Williams scowled, his brow furrowed in frustration, but Forster stood firm. The tension in the room was palpable, everyone waiting for a response. Are you insane? Captain Williams shot back, his tone sharp. She's not even certified. She doesn't even have a license to fly. But Forster's gaze didn't waver. She's not certified to fail, either. Right now, those soldiers are going to die unless someone does something different. For a brief moment, the room held its breath. The officers knew that they had no time to argue further. The helicopter's descent was accelerating, its movements erratic. No one had a better idea. No one had the time to make a calculated decision. With a reluctant nod, Captain Williams gave his consent. Fine, but if anything goes wrong, it's on you. Eliza didn't wait for another word. Her fingers flew across the control panel, entering the precise sequence she had memorized. It was just like the simulation, just like the countless hours she had spent in the dead of night, learning the protocol for exactly this kind of situation. Her hands were steady, each movement deliberate as she adjusted the glide path, recalculated the approach, and transmitted new vector coordinates. The helicopter, struggling against the relentless crosswinds, slowly began to regain some control. The emergency flaps deployed, creating enough drag to slow the aircraft just enough to make a more controlled descent. Eliza's heart pounded, but there was no panic, no hesitation. The helicopter was still descending, but it was no longer in a freefall. It was a controlled drop, inching closer to the ground. The seconds ticked by slowly, painfully. The helicopter's descent was no longer a fatal plummet, but a rough landing that could still save the lives of the injured soldiers on board. Eliza's hands hovered over the controls, making micro-adjustments, feeling the aircraft's every subtle movement. Her eyes never left the radar, her mind laser-focused on the task at hand. And then, with a thud, the helicopter touched down, bouncing once before settling onto the landing pad with a loud mechanical groan. The control room went completely silent, the hum of the equipment the only sound filling the air. The voice of the pilot crackled through the radio, relief and disbelief in his voice. F18 Delta to control tower. We're down. Safe. We don't know how that happened. But thank you. Who was on the radio? The officers in the control room exchanged looks of shock. All eyes turned toward Eliza, still standing by the control panel, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline began to wear off. She looked up slowly, meeting their gazes with quiet calm. I just used the standard emergency protocol, she said softly. It was Scenario A-2 from the Advanced Simulation Database. She spoke as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Captain Williams cleared his throat, his expression unreadable. How many times have you run that scenario? Monroe, he asked, his voice low. Eliza swallowed, the weight of the question sinking in. About 100 times, sir, she replied, her voice steady. I practice every night after my shift ends. The words hung in the air, the silence stretching out in the aftermath of the successful landing. The rest of the room was still trying to process what had just happened. One of their interns, someone they had dismissed as a mere observer, had just done what none of them could have. The control room was still, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Eliza had done the impossible. She had saved 4 lives, and for the first time, the people who had dismissed her, who had failed to see her worth, were left, speechless. The chaos in the control room intensified as the seconds ticked by. Officers shouted at one another. scrambling to devise a solution to the helicopter's rapidly worsening situation. The F-18 Delta was fighting to stay airborne, but every moment it stayed in the air was a gamble. Eliza stood quietly in the corner, unnoticed by most. Her eyes locked onto the radar screen. She could feel the weight of the moment. Everyone else was lost in the confusion, but she was seeing something no one else had caught. She knew what had to be done. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the certainty that she could make a difference. Without waiting for permission, Eliza stepped forward. Her voice broke the cacophony of frantic orders. "I need to make a quick vector change," she said, her tone calm and focused. She felt the eyes of everyone in the room turn toward her, but her gaze never wavered. The data was clear to her. She had seen it all before in her countless late-night simulator sessions. The crosswinds, the failing engine, the steep approach, they were all there, just as she had trained for. She could already picture the exact solution. Captain Williams, who had already dismissed her once, turned toward her with a frown. "You're not certified to be giving orders," he snapped, his voice tight with frustration. Eliza didn't flinch. She'd expected that. The world outside the control room had never seen her as more than an intern. But she didn't need their approval now. "We don't have time for this," she said quietly. "The aircraft is going to crash if we don't change the approach immediately." Forster, standing off to the side, watched her carefully. He had seen her work before, late into the night in the simulator room, when no one else was around to witness her dedication. There was no hesitation in her voice now, no uncertainty. She was the only one in the room who wasn't panicking. Forster could see it, the quiet confidence that the others lacked. He stepped forward, his voice carrying over the tension in the room. "Let her try," he said, his tone firm. The rest of the officers looked at one another, unsure of what to do, but the situation was deteriorating too quickly to argue. Captain Williams clenched his fists, clearly annoyed by the entire situation. "Fine," he snapped, his frustration boiling over. "But if this fails, it's on you." Eliza didn't wait for another word. She was already moving, her fingers flying across the control panel, inputting the new coordinates and adjusting the glide path. She felt the weight of the moment, the tension in the air, but she kept her hands steady, her movements confident. Eliza's mind was calm, focused on the precise steps she had rehearsed 1,000 times in her mind. She adjusted the vector, guiding the F-18 Delta through the turbulent air with the knowledge she had, honed in hours of simulation. The aircraft's rapid descent slowed, and with it, the tension in the control room began to ease. Her eyes flicked between the radar and the aircraft's altitude, making small corrections as the helicopter began to stabilize. The path was still steep, but the aircraft was no longer in freefall. It was under control, not yet safe, but salvageable. As she continued to guide the helicopter, the officers in the room fell silent. Their focus shifted from the chaos to Eliza's hands, which moved with purpose and precision. Every decision she made was deliberate, grounded in the hours of training she had put in while no one was watching. The air in the room seemed to thicken with disbelief and awe as the F-18 Delta, which had seemed doomed just moments ago, now leveled off. The crosswinds, the engine failure. None of it seemed as impossible to overcome under Eliza's steady control. The final moments were the most critical. The helicopter was still descending, but it wasn't plummeting anymore. The wind howled outside, but inside the control room, everything was eerily still. Eliza's hands were steady on the controls as she adjusted the speed, her eyes flicking back and forth from the radar to the aircraft's systems. She had done it, against all odds. She had taken control of the situation and guided the helicopter toward a safe landing zone. With one final adjustment, she saw the helicopter settle onto the landing pad. The F-18 Delta's landing gear hit the ground with a jarring thud, bouncing once before coming to a halt. The noise in the control room was deafening. Not from the sound of the aircraft, but from the stunned silence that followed. Eliza stood there, her hands trembling slightly, but her expression was one of quiet satisfaction. She had done it. The helicopter had landed safely. 4 lives had been saved. The radio crackled to life, and the voice of the pilot came through. Shaking with disbelief and relief, F-18 Delta to control tower. "We're down. Safe. Don't know how that happened, but thank you." Who was on the radio? The room remained silent, the officers in shock. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected her. Captain Williams was the first to speak, his voice low and begrudging. "How many times did you run that scenario?" he asked, his tone softer than before. Eliza looked up at him, her expression calm, though her heart was still racing. "About 100 times, sir," she replied, her voice steady. "I practice every night after my shift ends." The words seemed to hang in the air, the weight of them sinking in. Eliza had saved the lives of 4 soldiers, not by chance, but by dedication that no one had seen until now. Forster watched the scene unfold, his face impassive, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of respect. He stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Eliza. "You did good," he said quietly, his voice rough but sincere. It wasn't much, but for Eliza, it was enough. The rest of the officers stood in stunned silence, their disbelief giving way to reluctant admiration. Captain Williams, still processing what had just occurred, let out a slow breath and nodded curtly. The control room was still, but the tension had shifted. Eliza had taken control when no one else could, and she had done it with the kind of skill and poise that no one had expected. The military personnel who had dismissed her as an intern were now forced to acknowledge her expertise. The quiet, determined intern had just become the hero of the day. In the aftermath, as the helicopter was inspected and the soldiers tended to, Eliza stood in the corner of the room, watching the officers speak in hushed tones. They were still processing the gravity of what had just happened. For Eliza, it was just another night spent doing what she had been preparing for all along. She had known, deep down, that her training would one day be put to the test. Tonight, she had passed. And though the world around her had shifted, Eliza remained calm, her focus unwavering. She had done what no one else could, and she had done it quietly, without fanfare, just as she always had. The days following the successful landing of the F18 Delta were filled with a sense of disbelief. The control room, which had once regarded Eliza as little more than a quiet intern, was now buzzing with a mix of admiration and concern. The military brass could not ignore the implications of what had just transpired. How could an unlicensed, untrained intern have the knowledge and calm to successfully land an aircraft in an emergency situation that even seasoned pilots couldn't handle? The answer, as it turned out, was the result of countless hours spent studying, training, and preparing in the shadows of Frostline Base. An official investigation was immediately launched. Questions were raised about how someone without the proper certification could have been allowed near the controls of a military aircraft. The higher-ups in the Pentagon began reviewing the flight data, going over every single detail with a fine-tooth comb. The data was clear. Eliza's actions during the emergency flight had been executed with such precision that even the most experienced pilots would have struggled to match her performance. The flight data showed an almost uncanny ability to assess the situation and react without hesitation, guiding the F-18 Delta safely to the landing pad. The Pentagon's review praised her professionalism, noting that her actions had surpassed the abilities of many in the field who had been flying for years. While the investigation was still ongoing, Eliza found herself under an unexpected spotlight. She had gone from being an invisible intern in the back corner of the control room to the subject of intense scrutiny and admiration. The officers who had once ignored her now sought her out, curious about how she had managed to save the lives of 4 soldiers when all the odds were stacked against her. Captain Williams, who had once dismissed her suggestion during the crisis, approached her with a rare look of respect. "You did something no one else could have," he said, his tone no longer filled with annoyance but with a grudging admiration. Eliza simply nodded, not one to bask in the spotlight, but rather content with knowing she had done what was necessary. 3 weeks later, after the Pentagon had completed its investigation, a commendation ceremony was held at Frostline Base. Eliza stood at attention, her heart pounding in her chest as her name was called out. The officers, the very ones who had once treated her as invisible, now stood in formation, saluting her with respect. The commanding officer presented her with a certificate of recognition, acknowledging her actions during the emergency and her exemplary performance under pressure. The room fell silent as the officer read aloud the words of the commendation for extraordinary courage, skill, and initiative in the successful landing of the F-18 Delta during a life-threatening emergency, saving the lives of 4 soldiers and demonstrating the highest level of professionalism. As the applause echoed around the room, Eliza felt a rush of emotions, but none of them were about pride. It wasn't the recognition that mattered to her. It was the knowledge that she had proven, not only to the military but to herself, that she was capable of far more than she had ever been given credit for. This was just the beginning. She had known it all along. The following day, Eliza received an unexpected visit from the base's commanding officer, accompanied by Staff Sergeant Forster. "Monroe," the officer began, his voice calm, "we've reviewed the investigation, and while we don't condone unauthorized access to military equipment, your performance has raised a question that we hadn't considered before. What would it take for someone like you to become a pilot?" Eliza's heart skipped a beat. She had been preparing for this moment in the quiet of the simulation room for years, but now that it was here, she found herself speechless. We believe you've demonstrated the skill and knowledge necessary to go. Through an accelerated pilot training program, we've decided to offer you the opportunity to officially begin that training. Eliza was stunned, the words not fully sinking in at first. It was as if the universe had finally recognized her dedication, her preparation. The next chapter was before her, one that she had always dreamed of but never thought would come so suddenly. A new journey was beginning, a journey where she would no longer be an intern, an outsider. She would be a pilot, and she would earn it through hard work, just as she always had. The military personnel who had once doubted her were now offering her the chance to prove herself in the most significant way possible. As Eliza embarked on her pilot training at Frostline Base, the transformation from intern to respected member of the military community was swift. No longer would she be dismissed or overlooked. Her name was now spoken with the same respect as any of the seasoned pilots at Frostline. She was given a full training schedule, beginning with familiarizing herself with the aircraft used in the program, such as the T-6 Texan II, the same aircraft she had simulated countless times. The real-life challenges of being a pilot were now hers to face, and she welcomed them with the same quiet determination that had led her to this moment. In the months that followed, Eliza's reputation grew. She became known not just as the intern who had saved 4 soldiers, but as someone who had worked tirelessly to earn her place among the ranks of the base's best pilots. She excelled in every aspect of the training, from mastering the intricacies of flight to navigating complex air maneuvers. Her mind, honed through her years of dedicated simulation practice, absorbed the lessons quickly. She became a symbol of resilience, of someone who, despite being underestimated, had risen to the occasion and transformed herself into an indispensable member of the team. Eliza's story spread beyond Frostline Base, becoming a symbol of preparation meeting opportunity. She proved that sometimes the most unlikely person in the room is the one who can change everything. It wasn't the years of experience that mattered, nor the certifications hanging on a wall. It was the understanding of the systems, the ability to stay calm in the face of chaos, and the willingness to act when the time came. Her story was an inspiration to others who felt overlooked, showing them that with enough dedication and the right preparation, anyone could rise to greatness. And as she stood in the cockpit of a fully equipped aircraft for the first time, ready to take flight as a certified pilot, Eliza knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning.